Tonight, we are crawling headfirst into one of history's most dramatic, chaotic, and frankly deeply unhinged eras, Tudor England. And no, Inansan, Ines, Inat, Wana, what, Ian. I do not put in the gift shop the parts that would make your modern self sit down, take a very long breath, and quietly book a one-way ticket back to the 21st century, dim the lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket up, and settle in, because tonight we are going somewhere that smells like tallow candles, boiled meat, and very old wool. Let us begin where the Tudors began every day, with teeth, or rather, with the slow, relentless disappearance of them. If you smiled in Tudor England, observers could learn a great deal about you, specifically how rich you were. The wealthiest Tudors ate the most sugar, imported at great expense, and their teeth reflected this accordingly. Queen Elizabeth I, by the end of her reign, was famous for her blackened teeth, a side effect of a lifelong fondness for sweet things, and absolutely zero access to modern dentistry. For everyone else, decay was still very much on the menu, just slower. There was no toothbrush. Some people rubbed their teeth with a cloth and a little salt. Some chewed on twigs. Most simply endured. Toothaches were treated with herbal pastes, vinegar rinses, and eventually, when things got bad enough, extraction. Extraction was performed by the barber surgeon, the same man who cut your hair and performed minor surgeries, working by daylight, with pliers and speed. Because speed was the only mercy available. There was no anesthesia. There was maybe some ale. You sat down, gripped something, and hoped it went quickly. Now, let us talk about what those barber surgeons actually did, because it is worse than you think. Bloodletting was considered a treatment for almost everything. Headache, fever, pregnancy, sadness. The theory was humoral. The body was thought to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness meant they were out of balance. The simplest way to rebalance was to remove some blood. So they did, repeatedly sometimes until the patient fainted, sometimes until the patient died. The fact that this did not work, ever, did not seem to dim its popularity. Instruments were not sterilized in any meaningful sense, because nobody knew germs existed. The same blade that lanced a boil in the morning might trim a beard in the afternoon. Infection was so common, it was almost considered a normal stage of healing. And then there was the water, or rather, the lack of trust in it. Tudor England was deeply suspicious of plain water. It was viewed as a vector for disease, and not without reason, since rivers running through towns were essentially open sewers. So instead, people drank ale, small beer, a weak brew consumed by everyone, including children. At every meal, the boiling process made it safer than water, and the alcohol, however slight, killed some of what the boiling missed. Adults drank stronger ale, the wealthy drank wine, imported and expensive. Coffee, tea, and cocoa had not yet arrived in any meaningful way. So an entire nation was, by modern standards, mildly buzzed for most of its waking hours, including the children. Now picture the streets. Tudor towns were loud, crowded, and absolutely rank. There was no organized sanitation. Households threw their waste into the street, often with a quick shout of Gardylou borrowed from the French, warning passers-by to step aside before the contents of a chamber pot arrived on their head. Pigs, chickens, and dogs wandered freely. Mud mixed with manure, mixed with whatever had been thrown out the window that morning. The smell in summer must have been beyond description. To walk through London in 1580 was to walk through a thick, living cloud of human industry in every form, including the forms that should have been buried. In the home, things were not much better. Floors were covered in rushes, fresh rushes laid over old, sometimes for months, sometimes for months, sometimes for months, sometimes for months, sometimes for nuts. Insects and the occasional small, dead thing. Erasmus, the humanist scholar, wrote in disgust about English floors, describing how the decent off-rushes was sometimes only changed once a year, and how the resulting smell, particularly in summer, was something a person of any sensibility could not easily forget. Beds were shared, often with strangers, rented beds by the slot, and you might find yourself lying next to a person you had never met in a bed that had not been washed since the previous traveler. Sliss and bedbugs were simply part of the cost of resting your head, which brings us to bathing, or rather to the Tudors' deep suspicion of it. Full immersion bathing was rare, partly because heating enough water was expensive, partly because bathing was associated with both sickness and moral looseness, and partly because the public bathhouses that had existed in earlier centuries had taken on a reputation that discouraged respectable people from visiting them. Most people washed their hands and faces. Some washed more, particularly the wealthy, who could afford scented waters and the labor of servants. But the average Tudor body was cleaned in pieces, infrequently, and never as thoroughly as a modern person would consider acceptable. Clothing, on the other hand, was elaborate, regulated by law, and worn for days or weeks at a time without washing the layers beneath. Sumptuary laws dictated exactly who could wear what. Purple silk, only the royal family. Crimson velvet, earls and above. Sable fur, nobility only. This was not vanity, it was social order made visible. When a merchant wore the same fabric as a lord, the entire hierarchy became confusing, and Tudor society did not enjoy being confused. Layered onto all of this was a worldview in which the supernatural was simply part of the news. Witches were real. The devil was real. Omens were read in the sky and in the shape of a chicken's entrails. A sick cow might be the work of a neighbor with a grudge. A sudden storm might be divine displeasure. The line between religion, superstition, and practical medicine was almost invisible. Charms, prayers, and herbal remedies were administered by the same person, often on the same afternoon. And punishment. Let us talk about punishment. Tudor justice was theatrical, public, and deliberately brutal. Petty theft could mean the pillory, where you stood in the town square, while people threw things at you. Worse crimes meant whipping, branding, or the removal of ears and fingers. Worse still meant hanging, often slow, often botched. And, for the most serious offenses, fries of a royal temper, there was drawing and quartering. A punishment so elaborate in its cruelty that the crowd would gather, the children would be lifted onto shoulders to see, and the message sent was unmistakable. The crown is patient. The crown is creative. Do not test the crown. How. They were replaced by fresh ones. Londoners walked past them on their way to market. Even death itself was crowded. Coffins were a luxury. The poor were buried in shrouds, often several to a grave, in churchyards so full that the ground rose above the surrounding streets. Graveyards smelled. They had to. There was no way around it. And in plague years, the dead came faster than they could be put into the ground, and the carts rolled at night. And yet, in the middle of all of this, people fell in love. They raised children. They told jokes. They invented recipes. They sang. They complained about their landlords. They worried about their souls. They hoped for better weather next year. Tudor England was not a nightmare. It was a world fully lived by people who had no idea that anything better was coming. To them, This was simply the way things were. The smell, the teeth, the pliers, the rushes, the heads on the bridge. Normal, completely, perfectly. Disturbingly normal. So the next time you complain about your morning commute, or the price of coffee, or the wait at the dentist, take a moment, sit with it, and then, very quietly, thank the centuries that stand between you and the Tudors, because they were tougher than us, dirtier than us, and considerably more tolerant of things that would send any one of us screaming into the night. Sleep well.